Hello, my name is Barbara Aaron, and I'm very happy that you're attending the online symposium of the Child Language Committee of the International Association of Communication Sciences and Disorders. And I'm very pleased to be able to talk with you about teaching adolescents who struggle with language how to identify fake news in digital environments. I'm going to start with an advanced organizer so that you know what to expect. First, I'd like to point out that there is a handout available, and I do recommend that you haven't downloaded it. If you haven't, that you do so now, because all of the detailed information I will be presenting is in this handout. So it'll save you a lot of note taking, or if you want to put notes on the handout, that would be good to do. As far as the outcomes go, what I'm expecting you leave this session with is having discussed the problems of fake news and its impact on society, having analyzed criteria for evaluating credibility of digital resources, and evaluate scaffolding techniques for adolescents who struggle with language. And that will be the key of what we really want to do here today. And as well as identify resources for evaluating credibility of digital information that you can use in the future. So the order in which I will address these things is first, defining fake news, understanding the problem, evaluating news in digital environments, scaffolding for adolescents who struggle with language, and identifying resources. So buckle up, here we go. First, let's define fake news. We've all heard about it. We may have different understandings of what it means, but it really starts out living in the domain of digital literacy. And we talk about information literacy, we talk about media literacy, and those really deal with individuals' ability to make sense and deal with information presented in a variety of formats in the media, not necessarily only digital. So when we are talking specifically about digital literacy, it is a subset of information literacy and media literacy. And I like this particular definition, a holistic approach to cultivating skills to allow people to participate meaningfully in online communities, interpret the changing digital landscape, understand the relationships between systemic isms and information, and unlock the power of digital tools for good. We'll look a little bit up the road here in terms of how important this is, but right now let's just stick to definitions. Fake news, and it is a problem. It's a problem all over the world. Can be defined as disinformation and hoaxes published on websites either for political purposes or to drive web traffic. The idea that clicks make a difference in terms of advertising and generate money for different websites, and the incorrect information being passed along by social media. So that's our understanding of fake news as a basis for moving forward. What makes a news story fake? And this is by no means the whole story, but these are just some key factors. It's fake if it can't be verified. It's often fake if it appeals to emotions. If when you read a particular item on your smartphone or on your computer, if you get a gut reaction, either anger or sadness and glee, it may be suspect, okay? Authors aren't usually experts. They may be experts in other fields, but they're not expert in the field that's being represented. The information can't be found anywhere else. You can't verify it from other sources. And this one about fake news coming from fake sites, although that's true, we have to be careful looking at that one because sometimes there are sites that are not totally fake sites, but have misinformation embedded in them. So that's something important to consider. On the other hand, what makes news real is not whether you agree with it, as in the cartoon. It has nothing to do with it. In fact, that is a caution. Agreeing with something doesn't make it true, doesn't make it real. Real news is presented by real news sources, verifiable, respected sources. It's written by reporters, people who are acknowledged for their expertise in media, etc. The primary purpose of real news is to inform, not to inflame, not to scare, not to make you furious. And then, of course, real news can be verified. There are other reports that allude to the information that is on a particular site and can be substantiated. Those are some general things to look for in terms of fake news. But I think a very important caution is that news doesn't always fit nicely into one of two buckets. Sometimes it's not as clear and simple as this is real and this is fake. Often it is more nuanced. There may be aspects of a particular news story that have some basis in reality, but they are also not exactly true or correct. So we want to be careful, and this becomes important when we start talking about what we do with adolescents, is to not to promote the idea of a binary sort of decision, is this real or is this fake? Because it could be both simultaneously. Okay. Melissa Zimdars talks about 4 different categories of fake news. The first one is outright fake and false, regularly misleading websites. The second one is websites that may circulate misleading or potentially unreliable information, but may have some credible pieces as well. Category 3 are websites which sometimes use clickbaity headlines, meaning they want to grab your attention so that you'll click on a source, which usually has implications for dollars. Popularity equates to money sometimes. And then, of course, the fourth one is something that is outright satirical or comedic, which doesn't pretend to be real news. And my favorite example of that is from the New Yorker, is the Borowitz report. And the Borowitz report has really funny headlines, political satire, and there's no way that you know that that's real, that it's meant to be that way. But it's important that we understand these different categories. And Melissa points out that, again, no single topic falls under a single category, and then some articles can actually fall under more than one category. So here are just some examples where a false or misleading medical news item may be entirely fabricated, or it may intentionally misinterpret facts or misrepresent data. And we're seeing a lot of that in the COVID crisis. Also, it may be accurate or partially accurate, but use an alarmist title to get your attention. And then it may be a critique on modern medical practice. So again, it's not an all or nothing proposition, and you have to look at beneath the surface of what these things are. So let's now move to understanding the problem. And I think it's clear that it is a problem. I think it's important, this particular notion that, you as an individual, I as an individual, deserve the truth. We don't deserve to be treated like idiots, and the perpetrators of fake news would like to think we are. It destroys your credibility if you promote it or send it forth, if you tweet it out or in some way convey it to other people, you destroy your own credibility. It can hurt you and a lot of other people. And this, I guess, again, I come back to the COVID crisis and all of these conspiracy theories about the vaccine, and have people believing that they're being injected with some particular chip that's going to now allow governments to have mind control. I mean, that kind of nonsense, but it's harmful because people believe it. And we do have an even bigger problem with the pandemic because of people believing it. And then, of course, real news can benefit you. If you are having an election in your country and you plan to look at background data to decide for whom to vote, it is important that you find and digest real news. And when we look at these particular items here in terms of why fake news is such a problem, I think we can use this when we work with adolescents in terms of motivating them to want to pay attention to fake news. So now let's look at what the scene is digitally around the world. It's very interesting that the European Union has done quite a comprehensive survey in 2019 of 25,000 plus children in 19 European countries. And the bottom line is that most kids across Europe use their smartphones to go online. And why that's significant is that they have their smartphones with them all the time, unless their parents take it away from them, which sometimes happens, so that they have connectivity anywhere, anytime, and that poses a challenge in terms of access to fake news. I think it is also very interesting that in some of the research that has been done across Europe in terms of media and informational literacy, Finland is the most resistant nation to fake news. And that's across all ages. They are able to detect false information. Now, if you go to this source, and the reference is in your handout, and you go to that website, you can look at your country in Europe, this is Europe only, and see how you are able to, people in your country are able to detect fake news. In my country, which is the United States, the picture is not so pretty. In a study by Stanford University in 2016, they looked at middle school, high school, and college students, 7,800 students in 12 different states, and they asked these young people to evaluate information presented in tweets, comments, and articles. And actually, it's interesting to read the study because some of the words that the researchers used, you don't usually see in research reports. There was quite a bit of dismay, and the words they used were stunning and dismaying consistency in the responses of students, and they were basically finding that across these age groups, students were failing to tell fake accounts from real ones, activist groups from neutral sources, and ads from articles. That's pretty scary. And that they tend to accept information presented even without supporting evidence or citations. They also did a follow-up study in 2019. That reference is in your handout, and they basically found the same thing. That was with another almost 4,000 high school students, but the findings were pretty similar. So that's pretty scary. So when we look at the specific concern regarding adolescents, which is the population I have worried about my whole career, the bottom line is that their news consumption mainly takes place on the internet and especially on social media. And therefore, they have the highest chances of being exposed to fake news because it's on these platforms that these kinds of stories are posted and at times, go viral. Now, that's adolescents in general. When we start looking at adolescents who struggle with language, which as speech-language pathologists we deal with, there are added complexities to this issue. First of all, even if a student has a specific experience, either in the classroom with a teacher or on his or her own, he may not generalize the learning from one experience to another. Our adolescents that we worry about may need more scaffolding than they receive, even in secondary classrooms where digital literacy is being taught and identification of fake news is in the curriculum. The kids with language issues may not have enough scaffolding by the classroom teacher. And they may need more work in what I call the language underpinnings. Now, what I mean by that are the fundamental language skills that are needed to analyze digital information. An example, and it's just one example, is vocabulary. We'll talk more about this in a minute. So let's talk about evaluating news in digital environments in general. Like what's involved? What do we want to look at as we do this evaluation? Well, you want to be able to spot fake news, and some of it is pretty self-evident. Like, I don't think the Prime Minister of Canada really does have a pet alien. I don't know what's behind the story, but my guess he was probably doodling at some meaning, and it looked like an alien, and this became the news. That would be my best guess. But you have to consider the source, read beyond the actual article, which is a tough sell for some adolescents. Check the author in terms of credibility, credentials, etc. Are there supporting sources? Is this information verified anywhere else? Check the date. I've seen this myself quite a few times where you're reading a story and then you look and it was like from the 1960s. And that certainly puts a whole different spin on it. Is it a joke? Like the Borowitz report. Is it meant to be funny? And what about your own biases? That little cartoon we saw earlier of, well, it must be real because I agree with it. That is dangerous. We have to check our own biases as we look to spot fake news. And then, of course, asking the experts in the particular field that we're reading in is important. And this says similar points. Check the points. There's something called a CRAAP test, looking at currency, relevance, accuracy, authority, and purpose. We're going to look a little bit more into that in just a minute. But the bottom line is check the claims of an article and question everything. Don't take anything at face value. And then go through any of the links that are available in the article to see if that verifies the information that is being presented. So this is, again, these are some of this is repetitive, and I wanted you to see that different sources, while they may make different specific recommendations, the theme is pretty much the same, to look at the details and to really examine what it is you are looking at. And of course, fact-checking is a critical issue. We'll talk about that in a little bit because there are a number of excellent resources that help us with that. But I want you to take a look at what's on the right hand of that slide. And do you see where it says CNN News? Well, if you go to any CNN website, that is not their logo. Their logo is just CNN, not with the EWS after it. And little details like that sometimes are dead giveaways that it's not a real site. I know I get these phishing emails all the time, supposedly from my bank. They want me to, click somewhere to do something, and I'll notice that the logo is just a little bit off. There's a color that's not quite right. So these real details are important. These are some questions, and these are good questions to pose with adolescents. Although just giving these kinds of questions to the adolescents who struggle with language is not going to be sufficient, as I'll talk about in a minute. But questions like, why was this made? What was the motivation behind it? What does this information want me to do? Is it asking me to take some kind of particular action? How does it make me feel? And how do my emotions, what are my emotions, how do we interpret that here? What values, information, and points of view are overt and implied, okay? Now, as we talk about some of these things, you're going to see how some of this vocabulary, you should be, with a lens of looking at adolescents who struggle with language, some red lights should be going off like, oh, are they going to know what overt means? Are they going to know what implied means? Again, we'll talk about that in a little bit. What's missing from this message? Is it not telling you the whole story? And how might different people interpret this differently? And is this a matter of fact? Is it a matter of opinion? Or is it something else? So those are sort of like, 30,000 feet questions to ask about anything that you're reading as news. And that, again, in terms of working with adolescents, what we're trying to get them as a frame of reference. So this has been suggested as one way to evaluate a website, looking at those 6 criteria. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into this in great depth with you. It's here, it's in your handout. But these are some questions that go with each of those criteria. So these are the questions that might address authority, accuracy, objectivity, currency, coverage, and appearance. And again, I want to reiterate that it may not be an all or nothing proposition. So just as an example, under appearance, the site might look very organized, but it might be totally bogus. I mean, there might be just false information, even though it's a very professional and organized looking site. So there's a lot of nuance involved here with identifying fake news. This is an example, and this may be difficult to see, but what I wanted to point out is, like here, one of the issues is looking at what the website address actually is. So very often a .co is a hallmark of bogus sites, but a .org doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a truthful site. There are a number of different things to look at here. So this is supposed to be on a mission to inner earth. And one of the author here is a person whose credentials, when you look further, have nothing to do with the science. This person is a psychologist, so whether or not, she has anything to say about this is really immaterial. So these are just some of the things to look at. Again, I know I don't want to go into this in gruesome detail, but there are just some elements here that make you wonder. And this business of looking at details, there are some details in here that are actually accurate, but the whole story is false. Okay, so that's very important, again, from the standpoint of helping adolescents to see that it's not an all or nothing proposition. By the way, in my resource section of the handout, there are lots of resources like this that are offered to use with adolescents to do this kind of analysis, which is, I think, very helpful. Okay. So now this is the really the bottom line here for me. Anyway, it's all of this is worrisome for the adolescent population in general, but I worry in particular about adolescents who struggle with language. And if this is such a problem across the board, how might this affect the students either with language disorders or with language deficiencies of some kind? Okay. I offer these suggestions in terms of intervention principles. I believe we need to identify the language and related cognitive underpinnings that are central to the steps of identifying fake news, and I will give you some examples of that in a minute. But what we have to be careful of with adolescents is we don't start thinking about, well, we have to go back to, fifth grade language skills for high school students. That's not a good way to think about it. I think it's important to think about underpinnings as co-requisite rather than as prerequisite. So, for example, one of the things we'll talk about is students have to be able to identify a central message. Well, that's very difficult for students who struggle with language. So rather than do unrelated work with main idea and themes, it would be better to do it with the news items you're trying to analyze. So working in more depth in terms of getting kids to understand and state central messages, but not doing a whole bunch of unrelated things in that regard. Don't go get some worksheets on main idea or central messages. Work with the actual news you're trying to teach them to analyze, okay? Another point is that there are many elements or steps to identifying fake news, and it may be that for some of the kids we work with, we have to practice the individual steps in more detail, in more depth, and more explicitly in order to get them to be able to master this. So I'm going to show you the ProQuest Research Guide worksheet and go through that with you to show you what I mean. But it's important that after teaching perhaps individual components, that you teach students how to put them all together, because it's a process and it has several steps to it. And teaching the individual steps doesn't mean the students are going to be able to put those steps together. You have to actually do that with them. And as always, we need to employ evidence-based methodology, describe for adolescents what identifying fake news looks like, model it, you do it, have them practice with guided practice and then independent practice, and then teach them how to generalize. We just don't wish for generalization to occur because we know that doesn't happen. You actually have to work with different materials and different subject areas and different media in order to teach students how to generalize. Here are some examples when I talk about language and related cognitive underpinnings that I think play particularly into identifying fake news. You have to be able to identify fact and fiction. Do they understand what either one of those things are separately, and then comparatively can they identify them? Lots of vocabulary is used in media, and of course that becomes critical. Vocabulary, I worry sometimes that we overstate the case for vocabulary because it's not the only aspect of language that we have to focus on with adolescents, but it certainly is important. Students have to be able to synthesize information to form a main message, taking all the words and filtering them up to a central message. We know that that kind of linguistic cognitive processing is very often difficult for students who struggle with language. And they have to be able to formulate inferences from stated ideas. And there's a lot of inferencing that goes on with fake news. So they have to understand what that is and be able to do it. And they also have to be able to glean a writer's perspective. Is this writer trying to convince you about something? Does this writer have an axe to grind, as we say? So these are important things for us to look at. This is the ProQuest checklist for identifying fake news. And it's used to help students analyze websites. And I think it can be useful to us as amended, and I'll show you that in a minute. But I want to again say that it may not be a simple yes or no for each of these items. You see this, and this is in your handout in its full-length version. Although I have to tell you, there's a screenshot in your handout. If you want a clearer copy, just go to the website and download it. It's free. But you see there's a thumbs up and a thumbs down, and that means yes or no. It may be more nuanced than that, so I would want kids to be writing next to that whether there's something other than a simple yes or no. Okay. These are the steps in that guided research worksheet. But what I want to do is talk with you about scaffolding. So if you were to use that particular tool, what would you have to pay attention to scaffold for adolescents who struggle with language? So I'm going to take it piece by piece, but I don't have all that much time, so I'm going to go through it rather quickly. I do want to point out that you'll notice some of the words are highlighted in green. Those are my words that I suspect might be problematic from a vocabulary standpoint. In your handout, I actually list those in a list right after the sheet that you'll see with these scaffolding ideas. So they may not be the only words, but certainly they would be a good start in what you would need to work on with students to help them understand the language of identifying fake news, okay? So this particular step is to say, do a visual assessment. We do know from research about reading comprehension that in general, a lot of the students we worry about ignore a lot of visual aspects on a page, and that's going to be problematic on a website. So we want, when they talk about looking at annoying ads, well, what does that mean? What are the features that make an ad annoying? Locating an original source of an image to check whether or not it's authentic. So my point is that with students who struggle with language, they're not just going to be able to. You're not going to be able to just say do a visual assessment. You're going to have to break that down into the specific elements that are involved in doing a visual assessment and help them master each of those. Okay. Now here's the bottom line. After doing a visual assessment, they would have to be able to say, what are the positives, what are the negatives, and then draw a conclusion about the visual aspects of this site, which may not be just a thumbs up or just a thumbs down. Next one is identify the news outlet. Now, some of the adolescents I know and love don't know that that means a publication or a source. The word outlet, we have outlets in malls that sell inexpensive goods. That's what most of our adolescents would think an outlet is. So the idea of looking at whether or not this is a credible source, and this is going to differ certainly country by country, and they're going to have to have experiences with different sites. So going to credible news sources in your country and teaching them what some of the features are and what those look like, okay? And so what does trustworthiness mean, and how is one news source more trustworthy or more biased than another? These, again, are very nuanced issues that we have to work on with kids. And check the web domain. This is the business. I mentioned this before. that a .co is usually a flashing red light, that there's something bogus here, but just because the URL looks legit doesn't make it legit. So you're going to have to figure out what makes a domain legitimate. And again, some of the sources that I've cited will help you with that, especially Melissa Zimdar's work will help you with that. Check the About Us section. Is there one in general? And what are the details that are provided? And what would you want to know about these people that you couldn't find? And is it available anywhere else on the site? Okay. And look at one way to start with this sort of thing, I think, is to look at the credible sites first. Let's look at real news and let's analyze what real news looks like. What does an About Us from the real CNN site look like? What does it tell us about that site? And then looking at other sites, well, is this information provided on this site? Is it not? Okay, that sort of thing. Identifying the author, again, where sometimes this is well hidden. Who is the author of this? In order to deal with the author, students have to go outside of the particular site they're on. So after they identify the author, they have to look them up and find out, is this somebody who has a reputation for being a little loony? Or is this someone who has got credentials? And are the credentials in the area in which this person has written? That's another thing. Okay? And how to go outside and find information about authors is something that they would have to be taught in order to ascertain whether this is a trusted author for this particular news. Now, this element I have put in red because this is going to be one of the major challenges with the kids we worry about. As I mentioned before, identifying a central message. So you know that one of the patterns that kids often display is they can tell you the details, but they cannot tell you what the main message is. So I think it's not a bad idea sometimes with kids who struggle to start with the details and say, well, what are the details that we're being told in this article? And then why are these details being communicated to us? What is the most important idea around these details that the author is trying to convey? Okay. And then, of course, there's also perspective here. What is he trying to do, or she trying to sell you on something, trying to present an alternative point of view, looking at words that communicate emotion, and looking at things that seem to be ridiculous, like, Prime Minister of Canada having a pet alien. So believability, and looking at arguments and claims. Now, this business of arguments and claims, this is very typically taught by English teachers or language arts teachers in other countries. How, what are claims and what are arguments? What are cogent ways to set up an argument and make a claim? So students should be somewhat familiar with this in terms of their curriculum. Now, whether they need more work in this or not is another whole story. But this is going to be a tough one. And then, of course, assessing spelling, grammar, and punctuation errors, which is a hallmark of some bogus sites. You read them and you say, well, okay, nobody spell checked this. This can't be good. And they also sometimes use all caps and whatnot. But getting kids who struggle with language to identify poor grammar when they themselves might have it, this is going to be a challenge. But again, we need to work on it. But work on it not with a grammar worksheet, but with the news items in the resources that are available within this context. Work on, is that the right way to say that in our language? Okay. Analyzing sources and quotes. This is very similar to the author piece about look at the sources, the names of the sources that are being touted in this particular piece. Who are they? What are their credentials? Are their credentials appropriate? So the same kinds of issues that we talked about for authors, also for the sources cited, they apply here. And then, of course, there's a lot of summarization that has to be done. When students do these individual pieces, they have to summarize what they have found. And of course, that act of summarization linguistically can be a challenge for our kids as well. And then there's finding other articles to back up what is being told. But now, finding other articles have to be from credible sources. You don't want to go from one conspiracy theory website to another one, for example. You want to go to credible sources. So those are some of the things to deal with, those 9 steps. But this one, number 10, is a real critical one, and that's to turn to fact checkers. There are a whole bunch of sites that I've put in your handout to do this across the globe. But this idea that we sometimes need help checking facts. You're not just going to be able to, do all this research on your own. You'll spend your lifetime doing that. There are people whose work it is to check facts. So kids have got to learn how to use fact-checking sources. And again, using the ones that are credible, which are listed in your handout. And so let's talk about some of these resources. And I, again, just want to tell you what's available, and you can read them in a handout. This is the Melissa Zimdars I've talked to you about. She's got a Google Doc, which she keeps adding to, which gives tips for analyzing news sources and tells you which sites are fake in general. It's a wonderful source. And that all of the sources, not the reference list necessarily, but all the other sources cited in the handout have hyperlinks to make it easier for you to go right to them. There's something called Media Bias Fact Check, and that has, as you can see, 4,000 plus media sources listed in the database. There's something called Mind Over Media, and it has examples. This is one of the things I was alluding to before. It has examples for using with teaching students on things that are propaganda or fake. Okay. Here are other Australian sites and international fact-checking sites, which are useful to work with students. And then here are some fact-checking organizations who dedicate a lot of their efforts or all of their efforts to that. Now, this is a BBC resource, which is actually directed toward educators to help students spot fake news. So there are very important pieces on here to help you. Again, I think in general, we need to be working with secondary teachers. I don't think speech-language pathologists take on this whole thing by themselves, even for students with language disorders, but rather need to collaborate with secondary teachers. It's usually language teachers or history teachers who are dealing with this sort of thing. But it's really quite a trend in education around the world to pay specific attention to fake news. So if we work collaboratively with secondary teachers, then what we can do as SLPs is more scaffolding, as I've described, working on the language underpinnings to help students really get a handle on how to do this analysis. This is the Digital Resource Center. Again, it has some very interesting resources available for looking at sources. And then the National Association for Media Literacy Education, it's a nonprofit member. I joined, it's free, and it has something called Newsguard, which has journalists looking at information, and this is predominantly in the U.S., United Kingdom, Germany, France, and Italy, but I think certainly some of this information is generalizable to other countries as well. There's something, this one is in the States, but it's Learning for Justice, and it's excellent resources for educators in terms of looking at sites that don't tell the right story in history. This other one, this Civic Online Reasoning, is actually a curriculum that has been developed by Stanford University, the same people that did those studies on adolescents and young adults to look at how they're consuming fake news. And the curriculum revolves around those three questions. So that's a tremendous resource, I think, for you. And I think the bottom line is more and more resources are becoming available around the world as people are getting more upset and concerned about what fake news is actually doing to countries. So this is a very serious issue. I wish I had more time to talk with you about this. Hopefully you'll come to the chat and we can discuss things some more. But I just want to recap that this is what I targeted to do: discuss the problems of fake news and impact on society, analyzing criteria for evaluating credibility of digital sources, looking and evaluating scaffolding techniques for adolescents. That was the business of using the ProQuest checklist, but going more deeply and in smaller pieces for students who struggle. And then, of course, identifying resources for evaluating credibility of digital information. And I just would like to leave you with this thought that I think it behooves us all to help turn the fake news trend, and it is a trend, unfortunately, globally, and do our part by working with adolescents who struggle with language. So I thank you very much for your engagement in this presentation, and hopefully I'll see you in our live chat. Thanks. Bye-bye.